He didn't need an army to terrify American soldiers, just his name. In the brutal early days of the Korean War, one man's reputation spread through UN foxholes like a virus. They called him the Butcher of Hill 303, and what happened on that scorched hillside became the nightmare that haunted an entire generation of soldiers. This is the story of how a single officer turned psychological warfare into an art form, and why his name is still whispered in veterans' halls 70 years later. August 1950. The Korean War was barely 2 months old, but it had already shattered every assumption American commanders held about modern warfare. North Korean forces had swept south like a tidal wave, overwhelming unprepared UN troops and driving them into a shrinking perimeter around the port city of Busan. In these desperate early months, American soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating efficiency, and vanish back into the mountainous terrain before reinforcements could arrive. The Korean landscape itself became a weapon. Narrow valleys channeled advancing troops into killing zones. Ridgelines provided perfect ambush positions. Mountains like Hill 303, rising 1,000 feet above the Waiguan Valley, offered commanding views that turned every movement below into a deadly gamble. But it wasn't just the terrain that terrorized UN forces. It was the tactics employed by certain North Korean units that seemed to operate by different rules than conventional warfare. The Korean People's Army had developed a doctrine of psychological warfare that went far beyond traditional military objectives. They understood that breaking enemy morale was often more effective than destroying enemy equipment. Fear could accomplish what bullets couldn't, and no unit embodied this philosophy more completely than the 27th Infantry Regiment, commanded by an officer whose identity remains officially unknown, but whose methods became legendary among American troops for all the wrong reasons. Intelligence reports from 1950 describe him only as Senior Colonel Kim, likely a nom de guerre rather than his real name. What made him different from other North Korean commanders wasn't his tactical brilliance or strategic vision. It was his understanding that war was as much about psychology as firepower. American survivors who encountered his unit described a man of medium height and build, unremarkable in appearance, but terrifying in his methodical approach to warfare. He spoke fluent English, suggesting education in the West, or extensive intelligence training. Some reports indicated he had studied American military doctrine, giving him insight into how UN forces thought and operated. But it was his treatment of prisoners that earned him his reputation as the Butcher. Unlike other North Korean units that might execute prisoners quickly or use them for intelligence gathering, Senior Colonel Kim turned captivity itself into a weapon of terror. Survivors reported elaborate psychological torture designed not just to break individual prisoners, but to create stories that would spread fear throughout enemy ranks. He would stage mock executions, lining up prisoners and firing over their heads while counting down in English. He would force captured soldiers to write letters describing their impending deaths, then release one prisoner to carry the letters back to American lines. He would conduct trials where prisoners were accused of war crimes and sentenced to death in elaborate ceremonies designed to maximize psychological impact. The most disturbing reports came from the few prisoners who managed to escape his custody. They described a commander who seemed to take personal satisfaction not in killing, but in the process of breaking human beings down to their most primitive fears. He understood that a terrified soldier who escaped would spread more fear than a dead soldier who told no tales. American military intelligence began tracking his movements based on the psychological aftermath his unit left behind. Wherever the 27th Infantry Regiment operated, UN morale plummeted. Soldiers began refusing patrol assignments in areas where his unit was active. Some units reported near mutinous behavior when ordered to advance into territories he was known to control. The Army's 8th Division issued an unprecedented warning. If captured by elements of the KPA 27th Infantry, expect execution. Do not surrender. Fight to the death. But nothing in the intelligence reports prepared American forces for what happened on Hill 303. August 17, 1950. The 5th Cavalry Regiment was conducting a fighting withdrawal from positions around Waiguan when artillery fire separated two companies from the main force. 41 soldiers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Carroll, found themselves cut off and surrounded as North Korean forces advanced through the valley below. The tactical situation was hopeless. Low on ammunition, with wounded men who couldn't be moved, and facing overwhelming enemy numbers, Carroll made the decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He ordered his men to surrender. the North Korean troops who accepted their surrender wore the distinctive insignia of the 27th Infantry Regiment. At first, the treatment seemed almost civilized. The prisoners were marched to a dry creek bed on the reverse slope of Hill 303, given water, and told they would be transferred to a POW camp the following day. Guards were posted, but they seemed professional, even respectful. The prisoners had no way of knowing they had been captured by the most feared unit in the North Korean army. As night fell, the situation began to change. Senior Colonel Kim arrived at the temporary holding area, accompanied by several officers and what appeared to be a political commissar. Survivors later described watching him inspect the prisoners like a farmer examining livestock, occasionally asking questions in perfect English about American troop dispositions and morale. Around midnight, the sound of approaching artillery indicated that American forces were mounting a counterattack to retake Hill 303. The prisoners could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds and the responding fire from North Korean positions. That's when Senior Colonel Kim made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than evacuate the prisoners or continue holding them, he ordered his guards to prepare for immediate execution, not because military necessity demanded it, but because he had calculated that the psychological impact of murdering surrendered soldiers would be more valuable than any intelligence they might provide. The execution was carried out with the same methodical precision that characterized all his operations. Prisoners were lined up along the creek bed in groups of 5. Machine gunners took position at close range to ensure maximum effectiveness. Senior Colonel Kim personally supervised the operation, reportedly timing the executions to coincide with incoming American artillery to mask the sound. 41 American soldiers were murdered in cold blood over the course of 30 minutes. By pure chance, 5 men survived. Private James Yeager had been knocked unconscious by the initial burst of gunfire and fell beneath the bodies of his comrades. Sergeant Michael Torres was hit in the shoulder but remained conscious enough to play dead as guards moved through the area, delivering finishing shots. 3 others survived similar combinations of luck, courage, and the confusion created by incoming artillery. When American forces retook Hill 303 the following morning, they found a scene that seared itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. 36 bodies arranged in neat rows along the creek bed, each killed by close-range machine gun fire. The execution site had been left deliberately visible from the main approach to the hill, ensuring that advancing troops would encounter the massacre before anything else. It was psychological warfare taken to its logical conclusion, murder as a tool of terror. The Hill 303 massacre triggered the largest war crimes investigation in Korean War history. Military investigators interviewed the 5 survivors, documented the crime scene, and began building cases for eventual prosecution. But Senior Colonel Kim and his 27th Infantry Regiment had vanished. Intelligence reports suggested the unit had withdrawn north of the 38th parallel during the chaos following the Incheon landing in September 1950. Some sources indicated Senior Colonel Kim had been reassigned to training duties, passing on his psychological warfare techniques to other units. Others suggested he had been promoted within the North Korean intelligence apparatus. The most frustrating aspect for American investigators was that they never established his real identity. Senior Colonel Kim appeared to be a war name, possibly adopted specifically for operations in the South. North Korean records captured during the UN advance contained no mention of a 27th Infantry Regiment commander matching his description. Without a real name, photograph, or confirmed identity, prosecution became impossible, even if he had been captured. Proving his connection to the Hill 303 massacre would have been difficult without documentation or witnesses willing to testify. But for the soldiers who served in Korea, the lack of formal justice didn't diminish the impact of his legacy. Veterans of the Korean War continued reporting encounters with the 27th Infantry Regiment throughout the conflict. Each contact followed the same pattern: professional military operation combined with deliberate psychological warfare designed to spread fear among UN forces. Prisoners who survived custody by his unit all described the same methodical approach to breaking morale and creating terror. The psychological impact extended far beyond his immediate victims. American soldiers began developing superstitions around his unit, treating encounters with the 27th Infantry as near-certain death sentences. Some units reported that merely hearing rumors of the regiment's presence in an area was enough to trigger requests for transfer or medical leave. Military psychiatrists working with Korean War veterans noted unusual patterns of combat stress among soldiers who had operated in areas where Senior Colonel Kim's unit was active. Even soldiers who had never directly encountered the 27th Infantry Regiment showed symptoms of psychological trauma simply from hearing stories about their methods. If you've made it this far, you understand this isn't just about one man's cruelty. It's about how terror can become a weapon more powerful than any army. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the darker side of warfare. The broader impact on UN forces was exactly what Senior Colonel Kim had calculated. American and Allied troops began treating the Korean conflict differently, approaching each engagement with the knowledge that surrender might not be an option. This defensive mindset affected tactical decision-making, often forcing UN commanders to choose between risky offensive operations and potentially disastrous defensive positions. Senior Colonel Kim disappeared into the chaos of war as suddenly as he had emerged, but his influence on the Korean conflict continued long after his unit vanished from the battlefield. The psychological warfare techniques he had perfected were adopted by other North Korean and Chinese units throughout the war. But more significantly, his methods changed how American forces approached warfare in Korea and beyond. The Hill 303 massacre became a case study in military academies, not just as an example of war crimes, but as a demonstration of how psychological warfare could achieve strategic objectives without conventional military victory. Veterans who survived encounters with his unit carried the psychological scars for decades. Reunions of Korean War veterans often included discussions of the 27th Infantry Regiment, and some veterans reported nightmares about Senior Colonel Kim years after the war ended. The irony was that Senior Colonel Kim had achieved exactly what he intended. His name and methods had become a permanent part of American military consciousness. Hill 303 itself became a pilgrimage site for families of the massacre victims and Korean War veterans. A memorial was erected in 1955, listing the names of the 41 soldiers murdered in the creek bed, but visitors often reported feeling unsettled by the location, as if the psychological terror Senior Colonel Kim had created had somehow infected the landscape itself. Private James Yeager, one of the 5 survivors, spent decades trying to process what he witnessed in that creek bed. In his final interview before his death in 2019, he said something chilling. "We thought we were fighting soldiers. We were really fighting ghosts, men who understood that the worst wounds are the ones that never heal." To this day, his real identity remains unknown. No photograph exists. No trial was ever held. He vanished into history like smoke, leaving behind only the fear he had carefully cultivated and strategically deployed. The dirt on Hill 303 still holds their blood, and somewhere in that blood is the proof that in warfare, the most devastating victories are often the ones that happen inside the human mind. What do you think? How was he able to get away? And do you think the psychological effects are worse than the physical? Thank you for watching Nefarious History, and be sure to subscribe for more dark stories about warfare and human psychology.